Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Drug Cultures. I'm Sky Hawthorne. This is my show. All opinions expressed here are my own, as is all music. And as always, nothing I say on the podcast should be taken as medical advice. I wanted to do something special for episode 20, and I guess this counts as something special because your boy just got his first ever article published in High Times magazine a few weeks ago. I guess it's been about 3 weeks now. And it's actually a bit of an odd thing to be published in High Times, because if you know anything about the organization, it's extremely weed-focused. And this is a Kratom article. But I'm very happy it got published on the platform that it did, because I think it's a really important topic that will have tremendous implications for anyone who uses Kratom, uses 7-OH, or just cares about cognitive liberty or standing in opposition to drug prohibition. So I'm going to go over some of what's in the article, and then in the second half of the episode, I'm going to chat with a good friend of mine, Mr. Soren Shade, who runs a company called Top Tree Herbs and is intimately familiar both with Kratom products and the reality of what prohibition looks like. The main reason I wrote this article is in response to an announcement made last summer when Health and Human Services Secretary and maybe future Gilbert Gottfried impersonator Robert F. Kennedy Jr. declared that 7-OH, a chemical found in trace quantities in the Kratom plant and sold widely as an extract product, would be placed into Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substances Act. Some of you might be listening to this and thinking to yourself, what even is Kratom? Maybe not most of you. If you're listening to a podcast called Drug Cultures, I think it's safe to assume you're not necessarily a representative sample of the general population. But even among people who know some things about drugs, I like to call Kratom the most widely used drug you've never heard of. Because in America alone, as many as 15 million people use the drug every year. And for a sizable subset, we're talking every day. And maybe there are some of you who do know what Kratom is, but have no idea about 7-OH, which would make sense. Unlike Kratom, which has been used in Southeast Asia for hundreds of years at least, 7-OH extract products are brand new. Despite only hitting the market in 2023, over 1 million Americans now use them. This is the second Kratom episode I've done, and if you're looking for more of a classic-style drug cultures episode, I suggest that you listen to episode 2, Kratom and Insurgency in Thailand. I chose to focus on Thailand for that episode because that's where Kratom comes from, and the story of its use as a political tool to scapegoat the Malay ethnic minority in the country is a fascinating one. And it is also the story of the first ever known Kratom prohibition. In the 1940s, Kratom was banned in Thailand because it was cutting into taxes levied on opium imports, and the Thai government needed that opium tax to fund its war effort. Don't ask who its allies were in that war effort, it was a long time ago. But Kratom grows, or used to grow, wild in Thailand, and in Malaysia, and in Indonesia, and now it's farmed in countries where it's legal for a rapidly growing export market. And that export market is growing because a lot of people take Kratom in a lot of forms for a lot of reasons. The most common form here in America is leaf powder. And I say here in America because in Thailand, the fresh leaves are often chewed or brewed as a tea. But in America, most people who've tried Kratom do it in the form of leaf powder. It kind of looks and tastes like matcha. The tree itself is actually in the coffee family, and it is comparatively, relative to other drugs, low risk. Doesn't cause lethal overdose, doesn't usually lead to any sort of dangerous inebriation, and while there's definitely a risk of dependence and addiction, most people who do get addicted say it's easier to quit than pretty much any of the drugs that get called hard drugs. The substance acts on a wide variety of brain receptors, and at low doses, the effects are usually described as stimulating, At higher doses, the effects for most people become a bit more sedating and euphoric, like a traditional opioid, which makes sense as the drug does act on opioid receptors. And the reason so many people use Kratom is that in addition to being addictive for some, as I mentioned earlier, it's very helpful for a lot of things. I've talked to many chronic pain patients, for instance, who find Kratom is the only thing that gives them relief. I've talked to former heroin or methamphetamine addicts who were able to switch over to Kratom and, in their own words, get their lives back. And there's also a lot of people who use it because they just like how it feels, because it helps with social anxiety or is good as a pre-workout. Now, I don't want you all to think I'm glazing Kratom too hard here. The official line of the Drug Cultures podcast is, and always will be, don't do drugs, but also live your own life. But if you do drugs, you didn't hear it from me. Point is, Kratom, for all its very real risks, has been a life-saving drug for potentially millions of people. But like all goods and commodities, as its use has expanded and as the market for Kratom products has grown, so too has the corrupting influence of capitalism. And specifically, I want to talk about a divide between two groups within the Kratom world: the leaf Kratom industry, with its associated lobbying groups, and the upstart 7-OH industry. 7-OH is one of the active alkaloids within leaf Kratom. It occurs in trace quantities in literally every Kratom product, but only recently did scientists figure out techniques to isolate and mass produce pure 7-OH extracts. Now, let me be clear, both 7-OH and leaf Kratom have their legitimate uses, and both can be addictive. 7-OH, by every indication, is more habit-forming and more dangerous. And to be clear, both of these industries have behaved unethically in their own way. But leaf Kratom lobbying groups have gone so far to demonize 7-OH and advocate for its criminalization that they may have inadvertently put leaf Kratom's legal status in jeopardy, along with the millions of Americans who use it. I'm Sky Hawthorne. This is Drug Cultures. We'll be right back. For years, Kratom has existed in a legal gray area here in the United States, with no explicit regulation or prohibition at the federal level, but regarded with suspicion by regulatory bodies like the DEA. In 2016, the DEA attempted to ban Kratom federally. And it's important to note that this came very, very close to actually happening. The DEA wanted to put Kratom's two primary alkaloids, metragenine and 7-OH, which is short for 7-hydroxymetragenine. The DEA wanted to put both of them into Schedule 1, and they announced their intention to do so, and there's really one organization that I give tremendous credit to for stopping this from happening, and that's a group called the American Kratom Association, AKA for short. I spoke to the guy who runs the AKA while working on the article. His name is Mac Haddow. I guess he's technically the public policy advisor or something like that. It's his organization. And I truly do believe he deserves tremendous credit for mobilizing the community of Kratom users and industry leaders to fight this DEA initiative. The AKA mobilized its membership and raised hundreds of thousands of dollars, using that money to hire lawyers and lobbyists and eventually get congressional leaders to write a letter to the DEA and ask it to reverse its decision. Some of these legislators were progressives, as you might expect, including familiar names like Bernie Sanders. But Haddow is a well-connected guy, and while he doesn't speak about his personal politics much, I think it's fair to suspect that he's a pretty conservative guy. He managed far-right Congressman Orrin Hatch's first campaign decades ago, and this now-deceased Republican congressman also co-signed the letter to protect Kratom in 2016. Much to Mac Haddow's surprise, as he will be the first one to freely admit, the DEA listened. I cannot overstate how unusual this is. When the DEA announces its intent to criminalize a drug, it usually follows through. But instead, they opened a public comment period, and tens of thousands of people wrote in to testify about why they used Kratom, why they felt it was important the plant should remain legal, etc., etc. Health and Human Services, which had initially recommended scheduling Kratom to the DEA, eventually wrote to the DEA in 2018 to change its mind, saying there was not sufficient evidence to ban it. And ever since then, Kratom has remained federally legal. So what are the lessons from 2016? The Kratom community was able to mobilize together to fight prohibition and keep a plant legal for people who want to use it. And the American Kratom Association was really that lightning rod to mobilize the community and work as a very effective lobbying group to get this done. And anyone in America who uses Kratom for any purpose now owes Haddow and the AKA a debt of gratitude. However, and this is important, for all the good that the AKA has done to protect Kratom, I am a strong believer that the organization has been feckless and cowardly when it comes to the issue of 7-hydroxymetragenine. As I mentioned earlier, 7-OH is one of the dozens of known alkaloids within Kratom, and it's one of two whose psychoactive effects have been characterized extensively. By far the most abundant chemical in Kratom is an alkaloid called metragenine, but 7-OH is also present in basically every single Kratom product. Traditional leaf Kratom might contain something like 2% metragenine and less than 1/10 of 1% 7-OH. But that 7-OH is both more potent and more selective for opioid receptors. Metragenine acts on a whole bunch of other receptors, like adrenergic or serotonin, and 7-OH seems to act pretty specifically on mu opioid receptors. Now, Haddow has staked the reputation of his organization on being serious and following the science. In the wake of the 2016 ban attempt, many states across the country had bills introduced into their state legislatures that attempted to ban Kratom. A few of these passed, but Haddow and the AKA also worked with state legislatures across the country to push back against these ban bills and advocate for bills called Kratom Consumer Protection Acts, which were basically regulatory alternatives to a complete ban. As early as 2019, a lot of these regulatory frameworks placed upper limits on the amount of 7-OH that could be present in any product that called itself Kratom. Because even at the time, scientists knew that a concentrated extract of 7-OH had the potential to be more dangerous. But there were also just no such extracts on the market. So the 7-OH provision in Haddow's bills were kind of just there as a precautionary measure. When companies started actually selling 7-OH products in 2023, Haddow and the AKA suddenly found themselves in a tricky situation. Because a lot of the same people who use leaf kratom were also starting to use these new 7-OH extract products. And for the most part, the science says that these are people who use these products responsibly. Overwhelmingly, it's not kids we're talking about. It's 40-year-olds with chronic pain, basically. And despite a few isolated incidents, there haven't been a massive surge in poison control calls or any of the public health markers of a genuine epidemic in the way that we've seen with fentanyl. So the AKA had these two contradictory aims: protect kratom users, many of whom were starting to use 7-OH as well, while also protecting the legal status of kratom as a whole, which could potentially be in jeopardy if 7-OH turned out to be substantially more dangerous than leaf kratom. At first, in my opinion, Mac Haddow threaded this needle well. He met with a lobbying group that represented 7-OH companies and signed an agreement with them. Provided no 7-OH vendors called their products kratom, the AKA would advocate for 7-OH products to remain legal in their state-level Kratom Consumer Protection Acts. But just a few months later, in early 2025, this agreement started to fall apart. When I spoke with Haddo, he claimed it was because HART, that's the 7OH lobbying group, had failed to provide safety data for its 7OH products. And this may be true to an extent, but there's another factor that's a bit more sinister. I mentioned earlier that the AKA was tasked with protecting both the legality of Kratom as a whole as well as protecting Kratom users. But in order to function as an organization and in order to afford its constant lobbying across the country, the AKA needed the ongoing support of the leaf Kratom industry. And pretty much everybody in the industry was blindsided by just how well the 7OH industry was doing. In just a couple of years, between 2023 and the end of 2025, 7OH companies sold 1 billion doses of their products, likely to more than 1 million people in the United States alone. That is a staggering statistic, and it meant that all of a sudden, leaf Kratom companies were feeling it in their pockets. Because people weren't just buying 7OH at a gas station or adding it to their stack, they were switching from leaf Kratom to these new extract products. So the AKA was getting a tremendous amount of pressure internally, and that's where this other organization comes in. Stay with me. I know there's a lot of acronyms here, but this is important. I'm talking about the Global Kratom Coalition. Now, this is on its surface a very similar organization to the American Kratom Association. The Global Kratom Coalition purports to represent Kratom consumers and the Kratom industry and advocates for regulatory frameworks to protect the legality of this plant. However, while the AKA gets a lot of its funding from the millions of Americans who use this plant, as well as a fair bit from corporate contributors, the Global Kratom Coalition gets a substantial amount of its funding from one company. And this is a company called Botanic Tonics, which manufactures and distributes a product called Feel Free. You may have heard of Feel Free if you know anything about Kratom, or even if you don't. Next time you're at a gas station, any gas station, unless you're in one of those states where Kratom products are illegal, look in the window or behind the cashier. You might see these little blue bottles. That's Feel Free. And basically it's a cocktail that contains both Kratom and kava. Now, do I have any inherent problem with this combination? No. Kava by itself is very safe as far as psychoactive drugs go. And if you want to learn more about kava's history in the Pacific Islands, listen to episode 18 of this podcast. And I don't think this product is inherently evil or even something you should necessarily avoid. But this is a massively popular product, even eclipsing 5-Hour Energy in terms of sales at some convenience store chains. And the company who makes the product is run by a guy named J.W. Ross, who has been far from transparent or ethical in how he has chosen to run his business. In fact, early on in Feel Free's history, the bottles didn't even say that Kratom was one of the ingredients. Also, one of these tiny bottles is technically 2 servings. So people were buying this stuff in gas stations, not knowing that it contained a habit-forming drug, taking way too much of it, and getting really sick. This became such a problem that in 2025, Botanic Tonics was forced to pay $8.75 million in response to a class action lawsuit from people who felt duped by the company. So make no mistake, the Global Kratom Coalition is J.W. Ross's organization. Yes, they technically advocate for Kratom consumers, but they are also a feel-free protection racket. And while the American Kratom Association was fighting Kratom prohibition on a state-by-state basis, the GKC had decided its primary enemy, at least in 2024, was the AKA, and Mac Haddo in particular. Because at least at first, as these 7OH products started to proliferate, the AKA took a fairly even-handed approach to 7OH. Like I was saying earlier, Mac Haddo's position was basically Just don't call yourself Kratom and we won't advocate for your product to get banned. But J.W. Ross did not like this. And I have my speculations about why that was, and they're just speculations, but here goes anyway. Feel Free is in gas stations across the country, and not just a few here and there, it is fucking everywhere. Feel Free's target customer is someone who wants to stop at a gas station and buy something that'll make them feel better. And I'm not shaming either that person at a gas station or Botanic Tonics for making this product, but these are the exact same situations where a lot of people might buy 7-OH instead. And I think J.W. Ross was one of the first people to catch on to just how popular 7-OH was becoming, and just how much it was going to affect his own bottom line. And emails I obtained during research for my article back up this hypothesis. An extensive trove of emails in which J.W. Ross and his allies at the GKC tried hard to convince Mac Haddow to support state legislation that would make it virtually impossible for companies to sell 7-OH extract products. Mac Haddow, at least initially, pushed back, arguing that there was not enough evidence of 7-OH's danger, and that any bill that would ban 7-OH could have the unintended consequence of putting Kratom on the chopping block. For months, J.W. Ross and Mac Haddow feuded, and these organizations were at each other's throats, putting out videos about why the other organization was wrong or misguided. One of the craziest things that I learned from these emails is that J.W. Ross tried to bribe Mac Haddow to step down from his role with the AKA, basically telling him, "I will pay you twice whatever you are making right now to get out of my way." Haddow, to his credit, responded that he was not for sale. But the GKC was not simply arguing with a rival lobbying group. They were deeply involved in shaping the public statements made by the most prominent Kratom scientists around the world. The GKC gave $250,000 to the University of Florida for the specific purpose of Kratom research done by Chris McCurdy's lab. With this funding, of course, came the unspoken promise of access. And there was a tremendous amount of access, as these emails showed. J.W. Ross, as well as the Global Kratom Coalition's executive director Matt Lowe, were constantly trying to shape the statements made by these Kratom scientists. In one really memorable exchange, Ross kept trying to convince this one Kratom scientist, Kirsten Smith, that there should be a line removed from the public statement about how combining Kratom with other psychoactive substances presents increased risk relative to just taking Kratom. Wow, I wonder why the founder of a company that makes a Kratom kava cocktail would want to downplay the risk of combining Kratom with another psychoactive substance. Now, I want to talk about some people that I'm willing to give credit to, even though the bigger point is that they let me down. First of these is Dr. Chris McCurdy. For one, because he's an amazing Kratom researcher, very important Kratom researcher in the space, but also because, at least at first, he did set pretty consistently firm boundaries with the GKC. At one point, they tried to charter him a private plane from one end of Florida to the other so that he could present his research to state legislators. He refused, arguing correctly that it would be a conflict of interest. Too bad that that critical thinking didn't translate to him declaring this as a potential conflict of interest in any of his papers. More importantly, to me at least, is that as far as I can figure out, Chris McCurdy was one of the first people to advocate for the very thing that the federal government eventually ended up announcing: a placement of 7-OH into Schedule 1 that would leave leaf kratom alone on account of its relatively low concentration of 7-OH. This is basically the cannabis model. Since 2018, it has been federally legal to grow hemp, even if it has measurable amounts of THC, provided that those THC concentrations are below a certain threshold. So Dr. McCurdy was advocating this approach directly to the Global Kratom Coalition, and I have emails from 2024 to prove this. And wouldn't you know it, J.W. Ross from the Global Kratom Coalition is apparently a good personal friend of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. the very same Health and Human Services Secretary who would stand on stage 8 months later and lay out the plan to criminalize 7-OH. But none of this would have gone down the way it did without the consent manufacturing that the American Kratom Association would do as well. Because for all of Mac Haddow's protests in 2024, he pretty much signed on to the GKC agenda whole hog in 2025. In fact, the American Kratom Association put out a statement immediately after the RFK announcement applauding the decision as an important one for protecting Kratom consumers, instead of calling it what it is, another fucking drug war. And Haddow time and time again will justify it by talking about the terrible business practices of the 7-OH industry and the fact that they were dishonest in their marketing and about their science. And I don't deny that any of that is true. In fact, one thing Chris McCurdy told me that really stuck with me is that his lab didn't find measurable concentrations of 7-OH in any of the liquid extract products that they tested, which is obviously a big problem. But it's a problem, again, endemic to our capitalist system as a whole, and the argument seems rich coming from the same people who lied about the ingredients in Feel Free. Or, as I'll talk about a bit in my conversation with Soren, the same people who hired paid protesters to make it seem like there was more grassroots opposition to 7-OH than there actually was. And now we have this environment where the federal government has basically stalled on the process of following through on this 7-OH scheduling. You know, they've got bigger priorities like deploying the Gestapo on the streets of American cities and building 24 new ICE detention facilities. But states don't need to wait for the federal government to make up its mind. Florida just added 7-OH to its own list of Schedule I substances pretty much immediately after the announcement. Ohio did the same thing a couple months later. California is currently in the process of attempting some sort of ban that may or may not be a complete ban on both Kratom and 7-OH. And you cannot convince me that organizations like the Global Kratom Coalition are not at least in part responsible for this. Anyways, now that I'm done with my rant, let's move on to the next part of this episode. Joining me on the pod is Soren Shade. I know Soren primarily through his work with my favorite documentary TV show of all time, Hamilton's Pharmacopoeia, where he worked as a producer and has since gone on to help produce one of my personal favorite drug podcasts, the Hamilton Morris Podcast. But Soren is also a Kratom vendor. He runs a company called Top Tree Herbs. They sell Kratom leaf teas. And despite being involved, at least in the past, with both the AKA and the GKC, Soren has been uniquely principled in his opposition to a 7-OH ban, even though his company does not sell 7-OH extract products. Soren and I do not entirely see eye to eye on this issue, as you'll hear in the interview, but I have so much respect for his really principled stance. Like, it's easy to say protect cannabis, or keep Kratom legal, but Soren is one of those guys who will touch that third rail of drug science communication and say things like, opioids get a bad rap and our drug policies are deeply influenced by an irrational opiophobia. I don't entirely agree with that perspective, but I respect the hell out of him for being brave enough to say it, especially in this political moment when to huge swaths of the country, opioids are basically seen as an instrument of Satan. I'm not normally someone to use the phrase nanny state, but when it comes to drugs, especially opioids, the phrase certainly applies to the regulatory environment we live in right now. And Soren has been a really principled opponent of this and a supporter of individual liberties. Anyways, we will be right back with Soren after the break. us now on the pod is Soren Shade. I first became acquainted with Soren through his work producing season 3 of one of my favorite shows of all time, Hamilton's Pharmacopoeia. Please check that out if you haven't seen it already. It's the show that kind of made me want to start drug cultures in the first place. But beyond working in drug media, Soren also runs a kratom company of his own called Top Tree Herbs, and he's graciously lending his time to talk about 7-OH and the slow creep of prohibition within the kratom world. So, Soren, welcome to Drug Cultures.
It's my pleasure. It's always fun talking to you, Sky.
Yeah, I know, I agree. And definitely, first time we talked, I was a little bit, I mean, starstruck is the wrong word, but when considering you've worked on a piece of media that was really influential to my own media career, I just thought that was so cool. It wasn't until quite a bit later that I learned out that you run a kratom company. So how long have you been doing that?
I have been running Top Tree Herbs since mid 2020. I started it with a dear friend who unfortunately has since passed away, but he came up with the idea of trying to create a business model that would both be successful and help normalize Kratom at the same time. And this was right around the time that we were in the final stages of wrapping up season 3. So I was looking for something to do following that, and I wanted to stay broadly in the drug space. I wanted to be able to continue to be a student of all things related to drugs, and business and regulation are very important components of the drug reality that we live within. And I was pretty much ignorant of most of that stuff around that time. So I figured, jumping in headfirst into a business would be a good way to expand my understanding of how that regulatory and economic component played into the full picture of what a drug is and how we engage with it. So I joined Sam Weber in 2020 to stop Top Tree Herbs and try to normalize it with tea bags, kratom.
So why do you think it is that people have gotten so worked up about 7-OH extract products?
Well, there's a thousand reasons. I mean, there's the general wave of opiophobia that has swept the nation since, I don't know, the mid aughts. Not that opiophobia was a completely foreign concept prior to the aughts. I mean, there was definitely an early wave of opiophobia at the beginning of the 20th century, but that was more associated with racist context, people being afraid of Chinese immigrants bringing habits from China that they used to relax, like smoking opium. And then there became hysteria with that. And then we had some of the very first drug laws in the United States, period, targeted towards opium as a way to indirectly target, well, I mean, pretty much directly target Chinese Americans around 1906 to 1912. But then there is a new wave of opiophobia in the early aughts with the introduction in the media of the term the opioid epidemic, which is a very overused and little understood term, broadly applied to a reported increase in the number of people who have died and subsequently been found to have opioids in their system. And so all of this sort of coupled with a broader trend of prohibition in the United States and the body being a temple which is contaminated by drugs leads to whenever 7-hydroxymetragynine emerges on the market, naturally like an environment that is ripe to be fearful of it. At no fault of 7-hydroxymetragynine, but it's just got swept in with this narrative that fears opioids. And then you also have the flip side of the coin, which you covered pretty in depth in your High Times piece, which is there is an industry incentive in the existing legacy kratom space that would seem like they have motivation to protect their piece of the pie and not let newcomers selling a different variant of a product that they sell take over.
Yeah, Yeah, I think both of those are really good points. And I mean, just to clarify, when you talk about opiophobia, specifically when it comes to what gets called the overdose epidemic, I assume you're not, I mean, I think you said this, you're not saying there aren't problems with people overdosing on drugs. You're saying that the issue is more complicated than just opioids kill, right? There's the issue of the unsafe supply, there's the issue of unknown dosages that people are taking, and then there's the issue of things that are often polysubstance deaths. You know, someone dies with a bunch of things in your system, and we have this social and cultural bias to ascribe blame to the opioid. I mean, we have fear of drugs in general in this culture, but we also have, you know, an environment that has become
Yeah.
so afraid of opioids that people are struggling to get their pain medications. Doctors that were once in the past prescribing pain medications more liberally have now all this fear of medical backlash. Um,
Every variable that you just listed is 100% a factor and more. I mean, it's just the evidence
yeah,
is, look, we've been saying drugs broadly are the problem for well over 50 years now, and you know, leaving no stone unturned and no penny unspent to prosecute drugs and get people to stop using drugs and to raise awareness on the harms of drugs. And yet, here we are still in the same thing. It's clearly they are being scapegoated, and whatever the broader issue is, which is a complex constellation of nuances and broader socio-political and economic factors that are being unaddressed in the scapegoating of drugs writ large. And so clearly, addressing the drug problem isn't fixing whatever the hell the real problem is, and it's just a way for politicians to be cowards and not tackle hard problems, to just continuously throwing drugs broadly, whatever the fad is for the scary drug at the time, be it crack or marijuana or PCP or opioids at large, you throw those under the bus, you get political esteem for tackling a fake problem more or less, and then you leave the real socioeconomic problems unaddressed, and we continue to see, you know, every every metric that denotes a good life continue to fall in the United States and get blamed on drugs or immigrants or whatever the scapegoat is.
yeah, I think that's a really good point. That's why they often call, I mean, people who have their heads screwed on clearly often call drug overdoses diseases of despair, or even addiction as a disease of despair, because it's a sign that there's other things going wrong in your society and your culture and your life if you en masse develop this unhealthy relationship with substances. And I
Yeah,
think,
and I got a healthy tongue lashing from Carl Hart once whenever I referred to these things broadly as deaths of despairs. It's like, I hate that term. I hate that term. I'm like, why? I feel like that sort of like cuts through some of the drug scapegoating, drug bullshit that we often hear. He's like, yes, it does, but it's also cowardice to say that still, because you're just say what it actually is. Don't say drugs of despair. Say the industry has left West Virginia. No one can get jobs anymore. Say that healthcare is unaffordable, so people self-medicate. Say that people don't have promise anymore. Say that there isn't a hope for a good future and education's failing people. Don't say despair. Don't give people an out. Don't give people this vague, um, like outlet to excusing their actions that are resulting in people hurting right now. Like saying drugs of despair might let the people who crafted NAFTA off the hook. Saying drugs of despair might let the governors of West Virginia and Kentucky and Tennessee off the hook for allowing, people's poverty to swell and not be touched upon. And not to call you a coward for saying that, but just to say, yeah, just to say that I've said the same thing before, and I've been pushed to try to say more.
I think that's a good point. And I think you talking about our systematic abandonment of patients by the healthcare system. That's one huge example of an economic betrayal that our society has made. And it's very much connected to the issue of 7OH because, I talked to, in the article, I talked to Kirsten Smith, who's a great kratom scientist, has studied kratom, 7-OH, and she was pretty anti-7-OH extract product at first, and she has sort of adjusted her framework and changed her tune on the issue a bit, largely on account of talking to users of 7-OH, many of whom are either, dealing with what would be called substance abuse of, some opioid that is like a street drug, could be more dangerous. And for instance, they don't have health insurance, so they can't go to a methadone clinic. They literally can't afford it. So they have this alternative, 7-OH, that exists as a stopgap in the medical system. Maybe they don't have reliable transportation. I don't know how many of my listeners know this, but if you want to do methadone, you have to go to the clinic every single day. Some people have jobs. Some people can't do that. Some people don't have health insurance that can pay for that. If you want to be on a maintenance medication like Suboxone, that has a lot of serious side effects for some people. That can cause tooth decay in some people. There's a whole lot of reasons why the medically approved opioid addiction treatments might not work for some people. Same thing with pain. There's a lot of pain patients who, for one reason or another, their doctor won't prescribe the medication they need, or they don't have a primary care doctor. So they get this kratom alkaloid extract from a smoke shop or a gas station or whatever. And, you start to see the scientists who work with this population start to say, yeah, well, I'm not saying 7-OH is right for everyone. I'm just saying that there will be a huge amount of unintended consequences by removing this product from shelves that people use.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, the current opioid addiction treatment model is focused almost entirely on opioid replacement therapy, where we say opioid addiction it affects the human organism only through physiological means. You've taken an opioid so long that you have overexpressed the amount of mu opioid receptors in your body, so whenever you lack it, you go through some sort of acute withdrawal, and that's uncomfortable, and the way to treat that addiction is to replace it with a less stigmatized opioid, when there are all these sort of other variables of which you touched upon, like, one's place in the community. Are you seen as a person who goes to methadone therapy, or do you want to be seen as a person who can handle your own problems, be that depression or pain or sleeplessness, that you're able to self-medicate with opioids? Or, I mean, even you like to feel good in the evening or day, and the thing that does it for you is an opioid. Like, that's okay. And that is non-physiological components of the things that are broadly referred to as opioid addiction, in which these opioid maintenance therapies don't really address, and might be wrong for people because of the way that they're perceived or the way the drug feels for them. And going back to Dr. Smith, who's I love her consistency in the kratom space. She is just one of the few people with her head screwed on tight, and I respect the hell out of her for it. The fact that she was, nervous about 7-hydroxy when it first came out makes sense. Everything points to it being a very potent substance, and generally, the more potent a substance is, the more care it takes to use it in a way that limits the side effects and the negative consequences of it. But when she started interviewing real people who consume it and taking surveys and getting scientific data with regard to how it was actually affecting their lives, she saw the science and changed her opinion, because scientific overviews and surveys provide more information than anecdotal evidence, and she accepts that.
Yeah, I think that's what it means to be honest in science. And, this is another thing I talked about in the article, and we can get into this a little bit if you want. But the core of the story, as I see it, is one of scientific corruption. And it's one in which you have a lobbying group that's, you can call it an advocacy group or whatever, but the Global Kratom Coalition, relatively new Leaf Kratom lobbying group donates $250,000 to the University of Florida, earmarked for their research into kratom. That's Chris McCurdy's lab. A great scientist, has done some great work, but none of the papers after this donation were. It was never disclosed as a conflict of interest, and the Global Kratom Coalition has an agenda: represent leaf kratom and advocate against 7-OH extracts. So when you have this situation going on, when you have a lobbying group with deep pockets, and we can talk about that later as well, but you have this lobbying group with deep pockets that donates $250,000 to a scientist who then goes on to advocate for 7-OH scheduling, placement, let's call it what it is, prohibition, criminalization. Does that have the potential to erode trust in science? Does that degrade the quality of the science itself?
Yeah, I mean, this is the story of America and America's decline over the past few centuries. I mean, regulatory capture and institutional capture, and the failing of these institutions that are supposed to be the most esteemed ambassadors of Americanism and capitalism have failed. Like the American democratic process is the farthest thing from democracy that one could ever possibly mistake for democracy. It's all bought and paid for, and there's not a fair platform for any idea to take hold in the marketplace of ideas. It's entirely dependent upon how much capital you have to expend to get to get the media, more or less, another failed institution, to perpetuate your ideas. But going back to the question, which is with regards to institutional capture, and the donation of J.W. Ross, and feel free to the University of Florida, like this is par for the course. This is just how people get grant money now, and to say that the GKC is like utilizing a novel means of promoting a narrative that they want is to like unfairly throw them under the bus. They're playing by the rules of the game of American business, which sucks so much. But I don't want to be like unfairly criticizing them. It's the system, it's the institutional acceptance of, business as usual, which is the real thing that we should be focused on. Like these individual instances of regulatory capture are wonderful for coloring in like what's going on, but it is hypocritical to just point at them and say that they're bad, and to not address the fact that this is permitted, that this is allowed to exist.
Yeah, like why are scientists allowed to have their research on drugs funded by an organization with a specific agenda to criminalize a specific drug? And you brought up J.W. Ross, and I'd love to pick your brain a little bit about him, because I think he's a really interesting figure in this whole story. So talk a little bit about Feel Free, their story, and why J.W. Ross might have such a strong vested interest in 7-OH scheduling.
Jerry is a very interesting guy, and I have enjoyed most of my talks with him. We butt heads often. Whenever I was participating in Global Kratom Coalition work for probably almost 2 years, I was regularly corresponding with them and brainstorming and thinking. He seemed very open to ideas that conflicted with him, to his credit. Like, I will give him that. And for a while, he was, I think, sort of talked off the edge with regards to how bad 7-hydroxymetragynine is. And unless he's changed his opinion publicly or privately, he always stated that he thought, and this is like a quote, 7-hydroxymetragynine might be the next best thing since sliced bread, but the way that it has hit the market could potentially throw out the baby with the bathwater, and the baby being kratom as a whole, because of the scrutiny that comes from 7-hydroxymetragynine hitting the market. And to an extent, I agree with that sentiment. I think it's bad to tarnish 7-hydroxymetragynine. I think it is wonderful. I think it is, like any substance, completely value neutral until humans decide to do something with it. But the market that has become so closely associated with what 7-hydroxymetragynine is. When we think of 7-hydroxymetragynine in our head and the popular imagination, for most people, they don't envision a picture of 7-hydroxymetragynine as a molecule. They see it in pressed tablets or ice cream cone candies or tinctures. They see it as the way that it has hit the market and landed and being sold in gas stations in many states without age restrictions. And that market is not ideal. In fact, I would go so far as to say that there's a lot of dangers associated with 7-hydroxymetragynine existing in that form without a lot of education regarding proper dosing, what to expect from long-term use, how it may make you feel, and the fact that oftentimes these products are produced in less than hygienic manufacturing facilities. So there's just an unknown factor with regard to potency, purity, and possible contaminations in the product. And that's not 7-hydroxymetragynine being bad or problematic. That is the market which has coupled itself with 7-hydroxymetragynine, used 7-hydroxymetragynine as a vehicle for producing capital, which is not 7-hydroxymetragynine is dangerous. It's 7-hydroxymetragynine in an unregulated marketplace being used to produce a lot of money quickly being a problem. So I agree with Jerry's assessment of that, but I disagree, butt heads with, and ultimately have been thrown outside the orbit of the GKC with my disagreement in the way that this information is portrayed and presented in the media, which is 7-hydroxymetragynine is bad, it's gas station heroin, because ultimately the nuances are not understood, not picked up, and not repeated by the media properly, and essentially just being kratom is problematic again, because that's about as much nuance as most reporters can understand when they report on the news. So I think that angle that the GKC and AKA largely have taken of damning 7-hydroxymetragynine has backfired and has resulted in a lot more attempts to prohibit kratom writ large, including 7-hydroxymetragynine isolates. But I think it's as dishonest and unfair to place the blame on Jerry and Mac, while neglecting to also point the blame at the 7-hydroxy purveyors themselves, who have done things that a lot of sketchy and crummy legacy kratom brands did over the years, which was market it in dishonest ways, which is to produce products for the marketplace with absolutely zero understanding of how it's going to affect people in the broader population, just like without having basic safety studies beforehand. And in the way that they market and label is played a really big role in it. So I don't want to be on record saying Jerry and Mac have more have had a bigger role in getting us to this really difficult place now than the 7-hydroxy purveyors have. I think they have both screwed up in their own unique ways to get us here.
And they're both examples of capitalism and profit-seeking sort of overriding ethical business or lobbying practices. And I do want to say I agree with you about 7-OH purveyors behaving unethically. One of the things that Chris McCurdy told me when we talked is that his lab analyzed a bunch of 7-OH liquid shots, the tincture extracts, and found that none of them contained measurable amounts of 7-OH. So
Yeah.
a lot of these companies might literally not be selling 7-OH. Who knows whether at one point it was 7-OH and it degraded in the liquid shot, or who knows. Either way,
Yeah.
Clearly there needs to be better regulation on this space. But like you were saying, a lot of these problems existed and still exist in the leaf kratom space, including, a company like Feel Free, J.W. Ross's company, which at one point didn't list kratom as one of its ingredients. I know they fixed that. I know he's apologized for that. But that's part of his history, and that's part of the kratom world's history, is selling kratom products and not saying that they contain kratom. So a lot of this it feels like the pot calling the kettle black.
Yeah, I mean, and it's not just Feel Free. A ton of kratom companies use that, and that begs the question: why would you not want to prominently advertise that your product contains kratom, which is a plant which is known to produce feelings of pleasure and well-being in people? Why would you not want to put that on your website prominently or on your marketing materials prominently? Well, again, this is not to entirely absolve them of responsibility, because it is still an ethical thing and you are still a human being who has a moral compass and you should do the right thing, but there's a broader systemic force that is factoring into these decisions to downplay the role of kratom in your products. One of which being one that we at Top Tree have struggled with for years, which is being shadow banned or just completely banned from the most important social media platforms, which in the 21st century, if you don't have a Facebook page, Instagram page, TikTok, X page, whatever, that you are advertising and pushing and promoting your product on, you're not making a big splash. And Google Ads refuses to highlight or even permit the purchase of ad buying if you have kratom on your website, really. Like, if they do a text scrub on your website and find kratom listed on there, you're going to be deprioritized in search results, which is the closest thing to like a death bell that you can come across as an e-commerce business. So again, there are bigger factors at play. And why are they hesitant to promote or allow people to platform kratom products on it? Broader context of prohibition again, and the history of penalizing companies that have some sort of association with drugs, because we have to maintain this facade that drugs are bad, and as politicians, we'll do anything we can to scrub the scourge of drugs from our society. And that means punishing tech if they allow drugs to be advertised on their space, despite in 2016 it just being not made a Schedule I drug. Yet after 2016, all of these platforms said this is against our terms and services, which, in a world in which corporations have arguably surpassed the power of nation states, that's as much of a prohibition as, a prohibition of reefer in 1935 was in the United States. Like, we live in a different world now, and with Google and TikTok and Meta, disincentivizing the platforming and publicity of companies that have kratom in their text, the very generous reading is to say that maybe Jerry and Feel Free really wanted to tell people there was kratom in their product, but they had a lot of investors breathing down their neck, telling them that they had to make their money back. That's as real as it is. And it still is not exculpatory for not having a moral backbone and saying, screw it, I'm going to talk about it. But it's complicated and there's nuance.
Yeah. I mean, I would totally agree. But at the end of the day, when you have the arguments that people in the kratom world who are advocating against 7-OH, the arguments that they use, which is this industry has behaved unethically, this industry has been dishonest about their science, and their safety data. That's all the things that the leaf kratom people say about 7-OH. And then you look deeper into the history of these leaf kratom companies, and you have them consistently
Yep.
also being dishonest in their marketing. You have companies like OPMS, lying about deaths that were associated with people who took their high potency extract products. Not a 7-OH extract, just a full spectrum leaf extract. And again, I'm not saying that actually did cause the death or whatever. I don't know. I'm not the medical examiner. I'm just saying these companies were dishonest. These companies were not forthright. And you also have these leaf kratom companies that hired paid protesters. I assumed you saw about that. Companies like
Yeah.
Mid 45 that was hiring people to protest against 7-OH and paying them $600 to hold a sign, even though they didn't even know what kratom was or something like that.
Yeah, in my ignorance, like the casting website's advertisement for protesters for the Rhode Island AKA meeting, it popped up on my Google News alerts like 2 or 3 days before the protest. And I was like, oh my God, like the Kratom Danger Alliance or some anti-Kratom group is hiring paid protesters. I should let the GKC know, who I had a better relationship with at the time than the AKA. Like, oh my gosh, like this could be some bad publicity. And so I like forwarded along the casting call listing to the GKC, which, in hindsight, they were the ones that had put out the call to try to, um, you know, boost David Breaker's um, campaign to associate the blame of his son's death that was purportedly caused by OPMS shots towards the AKA for defending them as a CGMP vendor. I mean, it's just so convoluted, and I can't believe that anyone ever thought that this would be a good idea. Like that, you're just like handing like a present of of negative publicity to your competitors like against you by hiring paid protesters. It's just yeah,
There were multiple
whatever.
instances of this. There was the one you were
Yeah.
talking about, which was
And then at the
hiring
champs though.
the Champs show. Yeah. So
Yeah.
the first one was what you were saying. It was literally one Leaf Kratom lobbying group, the GKC, hiring paid protesters to protest the tactics used by another Leaf Kratom lobbying group, the AKA. And then and then my understanding is that the second one of these things was the paid protesters at the Champs show to more explicitly protest against 7-OH. But
hmm
still, you're a Kratom group hiring protesters to protest against something that 95% of the population will just think is Kratom. It will not make sense to anyone outside this world.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's really indicative of the echo chambers that people live in to like think that that is going to be a good idea that only turns out to their advantage. Like, yeah, that's all I have to say about that. Like, and Ryan Adele of Mid 45 and Jerry Ross of Feel Free, like they're complicated figures. Like, I do think that they have ultimately the goal of trying to keep kratom broadly legal and have, in a sense, had their arms twisted to take on what I now think and have always thought to be a bad strategy.
Do you think any of these people are regretting? Do you think there's anyone who advocated for 7-OH prohibition who's now looking at all this state legislation that this is state anti-kratom bills and saying, "Oh man, we contributed to this"?
Oh, certainly. Yeah, I know for a fact there are many people who are still, from as far as I'm aware, um, like connected to the GKC and the AKC that have regrets. I'm not gonna call them out publicly by name, but definitely there has been a lot of people who are constantly changing their opinions um, with regards to this, and where they land on one day and where they land on another is hard to predict. But yeah, I'm not gonna name anyone.
What do you think the future? I know it's a fool's errand trying to predict policy outcomes, but do you feel like we're seeing something that's going to snowball into a broader kratom prohibition, like nationally, or a wave of a lot of states? Or I don't know. What does your insight say here about the next few years?
Well, the way that it has presented itself in a in the national conversation feels like the most postmodern absurdist comedy that one could never write because it's so absurd. Like, the last time there was a lot of talk about 7-hydroxymetragenine on the national level was because it was part of a clip of Trump allegedly shitting himself at the Oval Office. Like,
Okay, yeah, we
it's
got to talk about that. Because I had
such a
heard,
weird.
I'd heard that clip. I'd heard that Trump sharded at the Oval Office and they had to clear the room. But then when I watched the clip, I was like, oh my God, they're talking about kratom. They're talking about
Right?
7-OH and then Trump sharts.
Working with the DOJ on addressing that because chemists are coming up with new opioids faster than the government has been able to keep up. We're going proactive on these new chemicals.
That's great. Now I hear fantastic things. Thank you all very much. We really appreciate it a lot. Thank you.
It's just so absurd, the world that we're living in, like, where you have to be a fool to make predictions, because how could you predict, like, all right, 7-hydroxymetragenine conversation has cooled down since last July, whenever they had Robert Kennedy and Dr. Marty and the head of the DEA on the stage giving this announcement. Haven't heard a lot on the national level since then. It's only been like state and municipalities that are sort of late to the party and trying to preempt the FDA to show that they're tougher on drugs than whomever they're trying to impress. And, all right, if I was a betting man, would I have predicted the next time that 7-hydroxymetragenine gets big public attention was going to be because of a loud-ass fart during an interview? No, I wouldn't have predicted that. So, yes, a bit of a fool's errand to try to guess, but sort of the optimistic side of me that I try to focus on is saying that the pattern of 2016 was there was this announcement, a lot of states followed, and we've spent a ton of effort trying to unwind what a handful of states and municipalities did whenever the DEA made the announcement, but ultimately the DEA didn't go through with it. There were only a handful of local bans, and all of that attention ultimately brought a lot more people to Kratom and has improved a lot more lives because people were made aware of it by this paradoxical attention that was created by people trying to condemn it. It actually brought it into the lives of a lot of people, me including. Like, first time I heard about Kratom was in 2016 with the announcement. And I went to a corner store and bought some OPMS capsules. Like, oh, I gotta try this. Just classic college student stuff. And then, yeah, the amount of people consuming it has increased dramatically. So if the pattern repeats itself, we're going to have a handful of states and municipalities that try to preempt what the federal government announced that they would do. It'll set prohibition in some local compartments of the country, but ultimately the amount of media that is created by this announcement is going to bring a lot more people to Kratom, except in those little areas that preempted with prohibition. And then the market's going to grow, and hopefully we hit a critical mass of acceptance and of normalization that the next time or the following time that people try to spread lies about kratom alkaloids, people will go like, I've heard of kratom, I've had it as a tea, or my cousin takes the capsules to help with mental health or pain, or because they like the way it makes them feel, or it's part of their wellness routine. And he's not a bad guy, or I'm not a bad guy for doing it, or the people in my grocery store can't be bad people who are buying it. This stinks of reefer madness level propaganda. And then hopefully, as all these failed attempts to pull the wool over the public's eyes repeat themselves and fail to fully come to fruition in a true federal prohibition, we'll hopefully eventually get to a critical mass of understanding and acceptance within the popular culture, that these things just seem so ridiculous as they are that no one comes to accept it anymore. That's the golden path of alternate possibilities, that if we can take that, hopefully we will eventually get to a place where Kratom is appreciated for what it is, and lies spread about it won't be swallowed without scrutinizing them.
Yeah. Well, I hope that happens, and Trump keeps shitting himself. I hope that keeps happening too. That was, did someone should tell? Maybe somebody told him that Imodium is an opioid, and that's why he keeps having these problems. That's
Hamilton sent me the video and was like, "Did you see this 7-hydroxy talk where Trump allegedly shit himself?" And that was exactly my response. It's like ironic that the thing that they're condemning right before someone allegedly shit themselves is the thing that can prevent you from shitting yourself.
It's all part of big diarrhea's plan. That's got to end this political corruption.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, Soren, thank you so much for coming on Drug Cultures. On that note,
a lot more toilet humor than I was expecting for this.
Me too. I think I just wanted a little bit of levity at the end. I don't know. Did you have anything else you wanted to add that we didn't get a chance to talk about?
I just want to share my appreciation for you, Sky, and your expanding written pieces, which I thought the Venezuela one was very prescient. Like, you nailed it. You hit the nail on the head, and it was a really good piece, and it was brave to write that, publish it. And the High Times piece is just falling within that trajectory of honest, brave journalism, and I really appreciate it. And it's an honor to be part of, your portfolio of media. So thanks for the invite.
Oh, thank you for coming on. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for listening. Hope you enjoyed that conversation with Soren Shade. Give the article a read over at High Times. Follow the show on x.com, drugculturespod, or on Instagram, consciousness_cultures. Shoot me an email at drugculturespodcast@gmail.com. Give the show a 5-star rating if you feel it deserves it. If you have any questions, think I got anything wrong, or have an idea for an episode or a guest you'd like to hear from in the future, I'm always all ears. Hit me up.